Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for a workshop on probity and transparency in governance. I'm delighted that Graham Shaw from Wrigley's has agreed very kindly to present this for us. Thank you, Graham. May I please remind all of you, although I know that's day 2 of the conference, you now know that if you'd like to ask any questions, just go at the bottom of your screen. You can see a tab for Q&A. So what we'll do, we'll try to leave a few minutes towards the end if any questions come up. And if we don't have time to deal with your questions live, we will keep a record of it and deal with it and then share the responses with you by the end of the conference. I will now leave the mic to Graham. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thanks, Marjorie, and thank you, everyone, and welcome to the workshop this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Feels slightly strange. I have to confess, this is I think the first time I've put my suit on in lockdown, so you might want to consider yourselves very special. I don't know, but I think what else is feels a bit strange about this particular topic. I think particularly in the current context is you may well be asking yourself, why would we want to look at probity and transparency in governance when perhaps there are more important things to be doing. But what I hope is that in our time together this afternoon, that we'll delve into that in a bit more detail, and hopefully we'll be able to get to a point where we think, yes, this really still is important, and perhaps particularly so in the current circumstances. So if we move to the next slide, please. So just in a quick overview, so we're going to start off by looking at what is probity and transparency, and then we're going to look at why it's important, what must we do, so what is a legal requirement or a regulatory requirement, but then what more can or should we be doing, and what can we learn from others, whether we're governed by a corporation or an academy trust. So moving to the next slide, please. So I have to confess, this is my first foray into polls on webinars, but the first question is, who knows what we mean by probity? So over to you, a quick poll. So hopefully you've got the hang of this, and you can put in your response. And so I'm just going to wait for those results to come up, which I understand from technical support that they will. Okay, so I guess a fairly even kind of split. Slightly more people, so 56%. Knows what it means, and 44 don't or aren't so sure. So if we move to the next slide, please. So what do we mean? Well, a quick trawl of various dictionary definitions kind of pulls up the keywords that you see in front of you. So if we start at the top, it's always a good place to start. So strong moral principles. So it's about ethical behaviour. It's about right and wrong. It's about values. It's about ethics. So it's about correct behaviour. It's about doing what's right. But it's about being honest as well, being completely honest, and doing what we do measured against high standards. And I think, I don't know about you, but when I first, think about probity, I do think of high standards. That's probably the first thing that kind of comes to mind, and possibly because we see a lot in the press, don't we, about the need for people to live up to high standards if they're in public office. But it's more than just high standards. It's about ethics, values, right and wrong. And ultimately, it's about integrity and character. It's about leading not just in what we say, but in what we do. So leadership by example. And it's about having, I think, courage. It's about courageous leadership. It's about knowing what's right, and it's about doing that and following that through. So moving to the next slide, please. So another question, and some of you may think, well, this is surely really quite easy, Graham, but who knows what we mean by transparency? And I don't just mean looking through a glass tabletop. We're talking here, particularly in the context of governance. So over to you. Okay, so let's see how we're doing on that. Yeah. Okay, so a fairly convincing win on that one for the yes camp, and some that aren't quite sure. But if we go on to the next slide. So again, if we look at dictionary definitions, these are the kind of words that and phrases that pop up. So starting at the top again, so fairly obvious, easy to see through. So the vast majority of us should understand that. But it's more than that. So it's about being open without secrets. It's about not hiding things. It's about being transparent, open. It's about being honest, and it's about being easy to understand as well. And the word obvious comes up in some dictionary definitions as well. So it's about being honest. It's about people being able to look at what we do and to understand it, and to understand it easily as well. It's got to be obvious. It's got to be plain to see. And it's about accessibility. So if people want to understand, if they want to know why we're doing something, then it's being able to access the information that's going to support that. So moving to the next slide, please. So why are probity and transparency important? Well, I said at the start that in some ways we might think, well, why is something like probity and transparency important in the current climate? Well, we're going to look together at the areas that you see mapped out there. So whether you're governed by a corporation or by an academy trust, you are governed by charity law and company law. So we'll look at duties of trustees and directors under charity and company law. Whether you're a corporation or an academy trust, you're governed by regulatory requirements. So we're going to look at those. Fundamentally, though, it's about public trust and public confidence. And again, we'll look at that in a bit more detail too. So over to the next slide, please. So in the charity law, trustees, so the trustees on your board, the governors on your governing body, hold what's called a fiduciary position, and that comes with high standards of trust and confidence. It's about promoting your charitable purposes, so it's about providing education and for doing that for public benefit. It's about acting in the best interests of your corporation or your academy trust and your beneficiaries. So we're talking here obviously about your students, parents and carers, etc. And it's about doing that with undivided loyalty. So it's about high standards. It's about being wholeheartedly committed to the purposes of your corporation or academic trust. It's about good faith. So we hear that phrase bandied about a fair bit, but what does that mean? Well, it's about honesty. It's about honest intentions and motives. So again, people should be able to look at what we do, see what we do, understand it, and see that it comes from a good place. Obviously, we can only do as a charity what our articles allow us to do, and that goes for a corporation or an academy trust. We must do that prudently, do that carefully, and it's about acting collectively. Just going back to prudence, so in the current COVID-19 crisis, there's been obviously much debate around DfE guidance. To what extent is it satisfactory or not? But more fundamentally, to what extent should we as corporations and academy trusts comply with it? Well, it's about approaching that prudently, undertaking due diligence, making careful, considered decisions that stand up to scrutiny. In terms of acting collectively, it is, simply making collective decisions, taking decisions collectively. But more fundamentally, it's about teamwork and how we stand together as a board or a governing body on decisions that we take. So to the next slide, please. So company law, and again, we have the duties of directors here. They chime with the duties of trustees. So it's about only doing what the powers of the company will allow us to do. So again, it's about your articles. So that's about doing what's right. It's about promoting the success of your corporation, your academy trust. And it's about exercising independent judgment. So it's about avoiding conflicts of interest or being swayed by duties or obligations or perhaps alliances with third parties. It's about making judgments and decisions that are solely and purely in the interests of the corporation or of the academy trust. And if we take again the example of COVID-19 and DfE guidance, care has been needed and continues to be needed to give careful thought to the DfE guidance and to do what's right and in the best interest of the corporation, of the academy trust, whether or not that necessarily syncs or synchronises with DfE guidance. It's about taking those careful and considered decisions. It's about exercising reasonable care and skill and doing the necessary groundwork so that when decisions are taken, when as a corporation or an academy trust we do particular things, then we do it for the right reasons, and again it stands up to scrutiny. So over to the next slide, please. So looking just briefly at regulatory requirements, for the purposes of this particular workshop, I'm assuming that you're, whether as a corporation or as an academy trust, that you're familiar with those particular regulatory requirements. If you have particular queries, then do please let me know, and I'm happy to discuss those with you offline. But within the confines of the workshop, and in trying to address particular topics and areas that are common to a corporation or an academy trust, then just giving a relatively light touch to this particular area. But you will know, nonetheless, that your funding agreement and the accounts direction and your applicable handbook sets out a whole range of regulatory requirements in terms of probity, how you conduct yourself, and also transparency. So how students, parents, carers, stakeholders, members of the public can see what you're doing and why you're doing it. What feeds into that is obviously your requirement for an external audit, again conducted in accordance with your accounts direction, and those audited accounts obviously then get published so people can see what you've been doing, in terms of your annual report too. And ultimately, the incentive, I guess, to comply with regulatory requirements, ultimately is in the form of intervention. So if the department has concerns that you're not delivering on those requirements, then ultimately it can intervene. So just moving to the next slide, please. So we've talked about company law, charity law, and regulatory requirements, and all of those are obviously fundamentally important. They're legal or regulatory requirements. But to my mind, the wider issue of public trust and confidence in what we do is equally, if not more, important, particularly in the current circumstances. So, talking about these current circumstances, and particularly talking about COVID-19, we've seen over the last few months that in order for the government to tackle the pandemic, it has needed the public at large, the whole nation, to understand what it's doing and why it's doing it. So we have had the daily briefings where we see the data, we see how the various rates relating to COVID-19 are progressing, what they're looking like, and we also see the different stages of government policy in terms of dealing with it. Ultimately, it's accessibility, transparency in that process that has been important in terms of public trust and confidence in why we've been asked to do what are quite extraordinary things. And the same principle that applies to you as sixth form colleges. You're having to do things in a very new way, and will have to do for some time. Currently, that's obviously it's a combination of online and some face-to-face tuition, and that comes with its wider issues in terms of mental health and well-being. So it's actually, I think, now more than ever that engagement and communication with students, carers, and the public at large, which is not only fundamental and core to what we do, but will be for us in terms of sixth form colleges taking people with us as we, I guess, continue to reimagine how sixth form college education will take place for the foreseeable future. So next slide, please. So what must we do? So just, referring back to the earlier slide on regulatory requirements, what must we do? Well, here are just some examples which you should hopefully be familiar with. The first area is that of the fit and proper persons test, which as charities you're required to comply with. So the test has its foundation in the Finance Act of 2010, but also in HMRC guidance. And we're talking here about your governors, your trustees, those in senior management being fit and proper persons to have responsibility for the management and administration of your corporation or your academy trust as an exempt charity. The kinds of issues that would cause a problem in terms of your corporation or trust not satisfying that particular test would be things such as somebody being one of your trustees or governors or a senior employee being disqualified from being a director or a trustee, or being convicted of some kind of fraud, for example. So satisfying the fit and proper persons test is the first point to mention. We touched briefly there on disqualification. So there are disqualification provisions in your articles, whether you are a corporation or an academy trust, and those provisions apply to your trustees, so your governors, and they will cover circumstances such as where one of your trustees or governors has been disqualified as a director or a charity, or a charity trustee, where they perhaps lack capacity, perhaps due to mental illness or other issue, being convicted of a criminal offence other than one that that is spent or simply carries a fine or lesser penalty, and also circumstances where a DBS certificate reveals an issue of concern. So it's about having an eye to those provisions as well. Yes, for your existing trustees and governors, but also for prospective trustees and governors. It's about having them sign a statement that confirms to you that they are not disqualified in any of those areas. Whether you're a corporation or an academy trust, you are required to certify and give assurances to the department around the regularity, propriety and value for money activities of your corporation or academy trust. Fundamentally, that's given by your accounting officer, which you have whether you are a corporation or an academy trust. If you're a corporation, it's your your principal at the college. If you're a multi-academy trust, then obviously it's your chief executive. They are personally responsible to Parliament, and their job is to monitor the decisions and activities of your board or governing body, and if they see or observe something that they consider to be inconsistent with your duties in respect to regularity, propriety and value for money, then they are obliged to report that to the department. Whether you're a corporation or an academy trust, again, you're required to have an audit committee. If your annual turnover is below a certain level as an academy trust, then that audit function can be performed by another committee, then which would ordinarily be your finance committee. But whether you're a corporation or an academy trust, you have to produce audited accounts, which must be accompanied by an annual report. And your accounts and your report must be published on your website. So it's about probity and it's about transparency. And your accounts must give particular details of executive pay, again, whether you're a corporation or an academy trust. And whether you're a corporation or a trust, you're required to publish a complaints procedure on your website as well. So those are just some key areas there in terms of what you must be doing, whether you are a corporation or an academy trust. Next slide, please. So let's look beyond strict requirements. Let's look at what we should be doing or what we can be doing. And a really good place to start is the Nolan Principles. Admittedly, it's some decades old, but if you look at them there, they, yes, some of them kind of chime with and reflect the statutory responsibilities, the legal duties of your board and your governors as trustees and directors, but they do go beyond that as well. And if we go to the next slide, please, we can then look at what these principles look like if they are adapted for your trustees. So let's look at selflessness. So again, acting solely for public benefit, that links across to trustee duties. Integrity, avoiding any obligation that might influence their role. So that's it's about conflicts of interest. It's about being wholeheartedly and solely committed to the cause of the corporation, the Academy Trust, and the college. I think objectivity is a really important one, making choices based on merit. So that links back to the duties of trustees and of directors in exercising reasonable care and skill and due diligence, and acting prudently as well. Accountability is a really important one. Accountability to stakeholders and the public, but also being open to scrutiny. I'll come on to this particular issue towards the end of the session, but I think that can seem particularly challenging, I think, to any charity, whether we're talking about a corporation, an Academy Trust, or any other organisation, because it's about being open. It's not about being protective. It's about allowing people to see what we're doing, to ask questions, and not to be scared of those questions being asked, and actually to welcome them, because by being challenged and having scrutiny applied does test the robustness of decisions that we take. So it's about being open about the decisions and actions we make, about honesty, about declaring interest and resolving conflicts, and it's about leadership through word, but also by example as well. Can we go to the next slide, please? So just out of interest, who here has implemented the Nolan principles? So over to you. Wow, right. So a really decent chunk of you. I have to confess I wasn't necessarily expecting that, but that is really good to see. I think the next question, if we move to the next slide, please, is what does that look like? So, we can look at the Nolan principles and think, well, they're very admirable, very virtuous. In many ways, you might say, how can I disagree with those? But if we take it a step further and ask ourselves, well, what should we do about that? Well, a code of conduct for trustees is a really good starting place, and a really useful guide is the one that you see here. So the codes of conduct for trustees produced by the Charity Trustee Networks. Now, this is, I think it's about 10 years old. But it's a really helpful publication. I think whether or not you've got a code of conduct for trustees, I think it's a really good guide, but it's also a really good refresher in terms of good practice and how a code of conduct can help boards of trustees, whether they're, whatever stage they're at. Ultimately, a code of conduct is helpful because, as the quote says here, conduct is more convincing than language. Next slide, please. So who has a code of conduct for trustees? So over to you. Right, gosh, a huge number of you again. That's really good to see. So if we go to the next slide, please. So many of you should already be therefore familiar with this question. So what is a code of conduct for trustees for? Well, the important point to make first is that it's not a legal requirement. It is simply an agreed set of guidelines setting out the responsibilities and behaviours of your governors, your trustees. Fundamentally, it's got to be appropriate to your particular corporation or academy trust. It's got to be fit for purpose. Next slide, please. So why have a code of conduct? If it's done really well, then what it should do is codify or record what's already working well. I think often as boards, as governing bodies, we can be behaving in a particular way and doing particular things that are really good, but without actually necessarily realising it. So it can be a really useful exercise to spend the time to sit down and record, write down what's working well. And in doing that, we can build a code of conduct that confirms what we expect of our trustees and governors. It can also support the recruitment of governors and trustees. So whenever we, whenever we're looking at a new job opportunity, whenever we're preparing for a job interview, we look, don't we, at the organisation. We want to know what they're like, what are their values, what's important to them, what makes them tick. And the same is true in recruiting governors and trustees. If you've got somebody who's in discussions with you or looking at becoming a governor or a trustee, then in the same way they want to know what's important to you as a corporation or a trust, what makes you tick, what values drive and determine what you do. Ultimately, a code of conduct can help avoid or address issues, but bottom line, it helps build team. Particularly so where it can draw on things that are already working well. Next slide, please. So top tips. So introducing a code of conduct or perhaps revising it or updating it involves change. So it's about change management. It's about managing the process. It's about perhaps having one or two governors or trustees on your board or your governing body to lead the process, to champion it, perhaps even a small committee. And it may be that you may draw on outside expertise to provide help and support too. As I said earlier, it's not about having one size that fits everybody. It's about having a code of conduct that matches your particular circumstances. I think the temptation and the tendency is to try and say anything and everything, in a code of conduct. But actually a really good rule is to be as concise as possible. Fundamentally, a code of conduct is something that you will want to have to hand to be able to refer to easily. And it's got to be in language that's easy to understand. It may and should include and reflect kind of legal and statutory duties, but it's also about behaviours. So it's about having the right language so that people want to use it. And as I said, it's about striking the right balance in terms of the level of detail. So the code of conduct will want to refer to, but not necessarily include, things that would appear in other documents and policies. So, for example, a conflict of interest policy. Ultimately, it's about having board approval for the code of conduct, and it's recommended that existing trustees and new trustees and governors sign the code of conduct as well to confirm that they agree to that code of conduct and will abide by it as well. Next slide, please. So what does an example code of conduct for trustees look like? Well, I've abridged one here. Again, this is taken from the earlier publication by the Charity Trustees Network. And looking at these particular areas, again, you'll see how this chimes with the duties of directors and trustees under company and charity law. So it's about acting within your governing document, so your articles and the law, acting in the best interests of your corporation and your trust, managing conflicts, respecting confidentiality. I'll come back to that in a couple of slides' time. And it's about having a sound knowledge of your corporation and trust and the local environment. Next slide, please. So continuing, so the other areas that an example code of conduct for trustees might cover are things such as attending meetings or giving apologies, being fully prepared, actively engaging and doing that respectfully, again, acting jointly, and really importantly, accepting a majority decision. This links back to the confidentiality point. So, if a decision is taken by your governing body and your board and it's been approved by a majority decision, then that is the decision of the board as a whole. And whether or not you agree with the decision that's been taken. What is really unhelpful is if, and you'll probably know this yourselves, perhaps from experiences, if you then have, perhaps a dissenting governor or trustee who doesn't agree with the decision, who then cries foul, perhaps publicly or outside of the board. That's a breach of confidentiality, and that doesn't help build team and trust and confidence, not just externally but within the board as well. So it's about working considerately and respectfully with everybody. Next slide, please. Another tool to look at, and I spoke on this at the summer conference last year, is a charity governance code, which is a wider tool in terms of supporting ethical behaviour, probity and transparency. And what it really helpfully does is look at the rationale for different behaviours, key outcomes, so what to expect, and examples of recommended practice. The recommended practice, you may recall from the session last year, it's not exhaustive and it's not all obligatory. It's kind of indicative recommended practice, which you can adapt to your particular circumstances. Next slide, please. So the Charity Governance Code covers the 7 principles that we see here, and I'm just going to focus on a few. You can see them in front of you, so you can excuse me, see what they say. But just delving into a bit of detail. So looking beyond organisational purpose, which is fundamentally, about the provision of education for your sixth form college students, and doing that for public benefit, so complying with your charity trustee duties referred to earlier. But it's about board effectiveness. So we've touched on this already, in terms of a code of conduct. Fundamentally, it's about team working, and it's about engaging in those regular governance reviews, whether conducted internally or externally, to ensure that your board is working effectively, that it shares trust and confidence between the different members of the board and the governing body, and as such that then translates out in terms of the trust and confidence that others have in the corporation and the trust. It's about the role of the chair. Having an effective chair is really critical and really helpful in terms of being that link between the executive team and the board or the governing body, but also driving strategy with the executive team and leading by example in terms of effective team working. I think currently diversity is obviously a very topical issue with the Black Lives Matter campaign, and what the Charity Governance Code does is provide really useful tools and a really useful framework for undertaking those audits of diversity of the board. I think it will be difficult perhaps for some boards, some governing bodies of corporations and academy trusts, perhaps to carry the confidence or the full confidence that they could have of students, parents, carers and others, if the diversity of the board doesn't necessarily reflect the diversity of the student community and the local community that it serves as well. Just conscious of time, so I'm just going to move to the next slide, please. So just got our final slide here. So what can we learn from others? So some of you may be a corporation, some of you may be an academy trust. So depending on your particular circumstances, you may or may not be doing some of these things already, but they are worth kind of just covering in brief detail. So you should, as a matter of good practice, have a register of attendance for your board and governing body meetings, but I wonder how many of you publish those registers on your website. I think that's a really good thing to do because it enables people to observe and know the level of commitment that you are giving to your particular role. I don't know how many of you publish details of your members, your governors, your trustees and your committees on your website. If you're an academy trust, then you're required to do that as a regulatory requirement. But that's just really good practice, so that members of the public can see who the members, trustees and governors are, and they know who to speak to if they want to share a view, ask a question. What about publishing minutes of your meetings? Yes, with confidential items, redacted. Publishing your register of interest so that people can see what other activities or organisations your members and governors and trustees are involved in. I think it's also about thinking intelligently too about how you share the details of your strategic plan and also your annual report, not your annual plan, apologies, as it says there. You're required to publish your annual report on your website. You will have a strategic plan, but how about thinking slightly differently but in terms of how you share and publicise that? Some people might not have the time or may find it difficult to read a lengthy document from cover to cover. So how about using social media to share the key highlights in sound bites? And it's about having those surveys with your students and parents and carers, finding out what they think about how you're performing, what you're doing, how well are you doing, what can you improve. And it's about publishing policies too. We are now approaching the end, so I'm going to hand over to Marjorie for any last minute items. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. That was a great presentation, very informative. We won't have time for questions, unfortunately. However, I would direct everybody to just post their questions on the social wall. So Graham will have a look and can very much deal with questions there. Or if anybody would like to contact us, and we can forward anything to Graham and put you in touch. So thank you very much. great presentation. Thank you so much for your time, Graham. I would like now to redirect all our attendees to first of all take a break. So have a break, and at 4:15 we will have a closed session of the National Joint Council, which will be led by Graham Baird, our HR director. So please, if you go back to the main page and access this session through the closed session, so it is closed to members only. Graham, thank you very much again.